Welcome back, everyone. So I hope you've been enjoying this little journey down the rabbit hole that we've been on. So not too long ago, there was the live stream with Punks for Progress, where he talked about his political philosophy. And it was a very interesting political philosophy indeed. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to look at other political philosophies and look at the political compass and sort of explain the political compass and try to plug in Punks for Progress political philosophies into the four-quadrant political spectrum to see what we come up with. And this is something that is very interesting to me. And don't worry, I am going somewhere with this, and you'll see. So we'll begin with the four-quadrant political spectrum. So before I get into that, the axioms of the four-quadrant political spectrum, you have the left and the right. And the horizontal axis is supposed to represent collectivism on the left and individualism on the right. And then you have the vertical axis, which is supposed to be authoritarian and liberalism. And that's how that's all supposed to shape out. So there is a four-quadrant political spectrum out there that shows where every form and system of government that we've ever thought of, it shows where they land on that four-quadrant political spectrum. What used to be just a Google search away is no longer that. It has been buried under mountains of four-quadrant political spectrum memes. You know, things like libtard, Nazis, and it took away, like, the actual, like, what these things are actually called. And I guess if I were to get it, I'd have to take a political compass test, and I'm not going through all that again. They ask a lot of questions. Takes a long time. So I do remember where a lot of stuff goes, and I'm just going to go off of that. But I think I don't even need that, because the most important parts of the four-quadrant political spectrum I already stored in my mind. So I know where they go. And I found a lot already anyway. So let's get into that. Alright, so here we have the traditional four-quadrant model of the political spectrum. And as you can see, the vertical axis, on the right you have individualism, and on the left you have collectivism. And then the vertical line represents authority versus anarchy. So authority versus less authority. So authoritarianism and liberalism. And under this we can see that the left hemisphere in the upper quadrant is oligarchy, mob rule. Democracy is somewhere in the center of the authoritarian left. And then towards the axis, you have representative democracy. And then on the anti-authoritarian collectivist side, you have social democracy. And then at the very bottom, you have collective anarchism. My understanding of the four-quadrant political spectrum is that anarchy is in all the way off to the left and all the way down to the bottom. So, total anti-authoritarian, no government whatsoever. So, on the right, you have individualism, where it says, you know, traditional dictatorship, monarchy, aristocracy in the center. And then towards the axis, we have republic. And then on the anti-authoritarian right, we have libertarian republic. And then in the center of that, oligarchy. And then the extreme anti-authoritarian right, you have lawless isolation. So this is the basics in which we plug in our different types of government systems. So let's have a quick look at that, and I'll do an overlay so we can compare the difference. Now this one is a little bit more detailed, but not quite as detailed as I really wanted. And like I said, I remember where the things go that I was looking for. So in this one, we have it's going off of the left and right, meaning like the right individualism, the left collectivism, the vertical axis being authoritarian at the top and anti-authoritarian at the bottom. And it lists in the anti-authoritarian bracket, it says capital democratism, and then progressive neoliberalism, ultraliberalism, libertarian capitalism, libertarian socialism. This is in the authoritarian activism. And the thing that I really liked about this one is that it actually listed feudalism. So feudalism is a very interesting point to keep in mind, because it absolutely does play a role into how these things are put into the political spectrum. Feudalism and tribalism, monarchies, theocracies, liberal democracy, democratic republics, National Socialism. These are things that I was looking for, as well as communist, Marxism, socialism, anarchism, anarcho-socialism. I would like to see all of those on there, but it's hard to find a political compass that is accurate in representing that. So, but it had feudalism, and I liked that. And we also have paleo-conservatism, conservative neoliberalism, ultra-capitalism. And so I'm going to go ahead and fade this one so that you can see like a better overlay. So let's go ahead and do that. This will give you a better idea of how the left, right, top, bottom, four-quadrant political spectrum kind of works. So now the things that we don't have in here is, I will explain. So basically, the complete anti-authoritarian right has tribalism in it. The complete anti-authoritarian left is anarchy. The complete authoritarian left is communism, and the complete authoritarian right is monarchy. So now the other thing that we have in there is liberal democracy, and we also have a democratic republic, and we have theocracy. Theocracy belongs in the authoritarian right, so does monarchy, and believe it or not, actually, the National Socialists, the fascistic neo-Nazi party, is up in the center of the authoritarian hemisphere and a little bit to the right. There's actually kind of a centrist authoritarian viewpoint. Away with that, now we're going on to this one, which still follows the four-quadrant political spectrum, the left being collectivism, the right being individualism, the top being authoritarian, and the bottom being less authoritarian. So in this one, we can see a better breakdown of everything. We have in the authoritarian leftist bracket, we have communism and socialist Marxism at the very top. Then next to that, democratic socialism, socialism towards the center, false socialist democracies in 1984, fascism, theocracy, oligarchy. See, fascism falls in the centrist authoritarian, so it's got a little bit of the left and right in it. And then in the center of the authoritarian left, you have liberal democracy. And then on the anti-authoritarian left, you have traditional democracy. And at the very bottom of the anti-authoritarian left, anarchy. And then centrist, anti-authoritarian spectrum of left and right, Neolithic tribalism. And in the anti-authoritarian right, you also have federal democracy. In the authoritarian right, federal republic, corporate aristocracy, corporate aristocracy, laissez-faire capitalism. And so this gives you a pretty good breakdown of how we classify these political things. And so, like I said, I hope that gives you a better understanding of the left and the right. The left meaning communal, the right meaning individual, the top authoritarian, the bottom less authoritarian. So that is why we put dictatorships in the authoritarian right, as well as communal dictatorships, such as communism, in the authoritarian left. And even though you don't like calling something authoritarian, that doesn't mean that it isn't authoritarian. For instance, I could say we should pass a law to make murder illegal. That is authoritarian. You are telling people, you are presuming authority over the people, saying you cannot do a specific act or thing. That is authoritarianism, whether you like it or not. It is following the actual definition of what authoritarian and anti-authoritarian is, and that is where you get this kind of axiom. So I hope we've cleared that up, but as you've noticed, something very strange is amiss, as he said that capitalism is fascistic, which is interesting because we don't see capitalism in any of these. So why is that? Well, there's a very good reason. The reason is that capitalism is not a system of government. It is a system of commodity and commerce, not a means of creating a society or a system of governing the people. It is literally trade, commerce. Another system would be the barter and trade system. That's the very fundamental of capitalism, is essentially where we got capitalism from, was the barter and trade system. And we would find that going back into feudalism and tribalism and anarchy in the original days, like as humankind, as actual infrastructure and society was being created. If we go back thousands of years ago, what we're going to see, like multiple thousands of years ago, like the beginning of time, you're going to see tribalism, you're going to see anarchy, you're going to see feudalism. And the thing that didn't work, the reason why we switched to capitalism as opposed to a system of bartering and trading, is because it didn't work. We had trouble assessing the value of, like, let's say somebody was a carpenter and somebody was a bread maker. Well, how are you going to pay them with bread? And that's just a very, very short, simple example. I'm not going to get into the intricate details of it for time's sake. I don't know, maybe I will. Alright, so now that we've gone over all of the original stuff that the four-quadrant political spectrum, as I understand it, the left being communal, the right being individual, the upper half is authoritarian, the lower half is anti-authoritarian. So let's look at Reverend Aaron's, from Punks for Progress, his political model. Tink. Tink. Blow that up. Alright, so here's the thing, is that the gist of what I was getting from him is that the left is communism, socialism, Marxism, anarchy, and anarcho-socialism. And then you have the right, which is fascistic, capitalistic, just everything else is on the right. Everything else, except for the centrist, is people like Ocasio-Cortez. Basically, the social democrats, or the democratic socialists, are the centrists. And then we have, for some reason, conservatives, are the only thing on the right that are not fascistic. I don't know why conservatives are the only thing on the right that are not fascistic, but apparently everything on the right is just fascism. It's just fascist, period. Everything on the right, everything, anti-authoritarian, authoritarian, whatsoever. So here's the problem with this as we're looking at this political spectrum. Where does tribalism go? Tribalism on the traditional four-quadrant political spectrum goes in the anti-authoritarian right. Pure anarchism, actually we had pure anarchism, which is on the extreme anti-authoritarian left, you would end up with tribalism inevitably. This is what we call what I would call the X variable, which is the variable that is unpredictable and inevitable. And in this case, that would be human nature. If you had total anarchy, you would end up with tribalism because we are a pack animal and we tend to, as the saying goes, birds of a feather flock together, clump together in little groups that we relate to and identify with. We would establish tribalism. Tribalism existed before we even had a definition of it. So going back and looking at things like feudalism, anarchy, and tribalism, we didn't define those things until we looked back at them with philosophy later on in life. And the biggest question for me is, where does a liberal democracy fit under this model? A liberal democracy is literally not a dictatorship at all. It's a government ran by the people of the majority. So the majority is fascistic because they're in control of the minority. Keep in mind, under a liberal democracy, everyone is seen as equal. You would not see necessarily a vote for gay marriage or not gay marriage. It would be, well, everyone has the same rights, liberties, and freedoms as everyone else, so we're voting on, are we for marriage or against marriage, period. That's a liberal democracy. There's not a whole lot of dictatorship about it, whereas the pillars of a liberal democracy, the only thing the government is there for is to moderate the masses. So it's designed to protect you from foreign and domestic issues. And then you have a democratic republic, which is what the United States is. We have a list of rules and guidelines to follow, one of those being secularism, but there's also a democratic element where it's done by the people's voice. So this is very interesting and intriguing to me that we would consider those things fascistic or authoritarian or a dictatorship of any kind, because these are not dictating onto the people. And believe it or not, you could have a liberal democracy without using the capitalism that we currently know and understand. We could have a liberal democracy with barter and trade. Kind of like the Greek and Roman empires. So I wouldn't say that those are fascistic. And this is a very interesting conundrum. And the other thing that I was pointing out, capitalism is not a system of government, it's a system of monetary. It's a way of controlling means of production, not necessarily controlling, but moderating means of production and the reallocation of resources. And when we talk about that, let's say that we have a resource that is finite and doesn't replenish itself very often and has and we have a very small amount of it, it's going to be extremely expensive, because if it's not extremely expensive, it's going to deplete rapidly until we don't have any of it left, especially if it's a resource that we as human beings need to survive. This is important stuff to pay attention to. Without that kind of system, if we had total anarchy where people had access to all resources at will, well, I have this to say to anybody that's concerned about the environment. You have to think about this. Our planet and the resources on it are finite. That's scary to think that that could just drop. And even Karl Marx said on his deathbed that his idea wouldn't even work unless there was an abundant amount of resources available. Ultimately, I do like the idea of the working class rising up above those that suppress them, because crony capitalism is a real problem, and corporatism is a real problem when it comes to this. But that is why I advocate for restrictions, certain restrictions on capitalism, so that they don't have the ability to abuse their power. And that is ultimately the problem that we are having today, where I think people are resorting to. Ultimately, I like the idea of anarchy, but the thing is like, because I hate being told what I can and cannot do, what I can and cannot say. I want to do whatever I want. But the problem is if you allow everyone to do that, you're allowing for pedophiles, rapists, murderers, thievery, just fucking barbarism. And there's a reason why we left that way of life thousands and thousands of years ago, and why we developed structure. We need structure because, well, we're animals and we don't always do the right thing. So we need we need systems in place to hold these systems and other systems accountable, to hold people accountable. And I will reiterate my philosophy. I believe in choices, not one's ability to impose one's will on others against their own will. So this is where my authoritarianism comes in, is authoritarianism is appropriate to keep other people from inflicting their authoritarianism on others. That is important, and that is why we need the government structure. And I think that anarcho-socialism, socialism, these things are beautiful dreams. The thing is I can build a house in my dreams, but doing it in real life, well, that's a very different story. We're also not even touching the basis of means of production. Like, let's say that monetary system goes away. Farming is hard work. We will not be able to sustain the population that we have today under, like, I've seen small communal, actually I have a friend who comes from a commune where everybody works together to make their little village happen. And the thing is that these work on small scales through tribalism. They don't work on a massive level that you have with the United States. Our entire infrastructure would collapse, and the things that we take for granted as leisure and things that we enjoy because of scientific developments and progress usually evaporate into nothing. So now that I've talked about this really weird, irrational political spectrum, and I'm not trying to poke a stick at Punks for Progress here, but this really doesn't add up eventually. It just falls apart and falls to pieces, especially when you take into account things like tribalism. How is tribalism fascism? How is a liberal democracy fascism? I would say that, like, a monarchy is a dictator, but not ultimately fascistic, because Queen Elizabeth I is a prime example of this, because she wanted to hold her people accountable for their crimes, not their religious affiliation, which was almost the beginning, or kind of a stretch into secularism, and the Catholic Church was really, really put off by that. But she was essentially giving her people that kind of individual freedom that other rulers under the English crown did not give their people. So it doesn't necessarily have to be fascistic, although it is authoritarian and a dictatorship at the same time. So we have to define what is actually fascism. Well, the very specific way that we look at fascism, there are the little things that they do that he gave a list of. Well, that's fascism. Like the prime example is thought policing and language policing. Anything that contradicts or creates insurgency must be destroyed because it goes against what the prime objective is, which is basically like it's severe extreme racial nationalism, and it's crazy because you're basically talking about that's just for another video. So I'm going to go on to the awesome Polish kid. He is extremely rational and dichotomized a lot of political philosophies into things that I think that are easily digestible and easily understandable. The kid's a freaking genius. He's a freaking genius when it comes to this stuff. Absolutely amazing, bright mind. And so I would just like to go over some of the rational points and perspectives that he has here for a moment. And here we go. So looking at the the awesome Polish kid's political philosophy, which I rather like, he is for LGBTI, atheism, equal rights, marijuana legalization, abortion and birth control, rationality, secularism, anti-clericalism, stem cell research, and libertarianism. So here are the things that the awesome Polish kid is against, which again I am in agreement with. He is against SJW logic, regressive left-wing ideology, religious fundamentalism, irrational moralism, regressive right-wing ideology. Then this is where he's mapped out the different political parties of Poland, which I gotta tell you, he is a genius when it comes to this type of stuff. So, and then his political leaning, major social liberalism, minor social conservatism, partial half capitalism, partial half socialism. Now, on this one, for time's sake, I won't read through all of it, but all the way to the left, he's broken down nationalism and globalism into a spectrum. So full nationalism all the way to the left, full globalism all the way to the right. But he's broken it down into extremism, mixed area, to non-extremism, and then on the right of the globalism, you have mixed area and extremism. And this is to illustrate that for nationalism and globalism, there's extremism on both ends, and there's mixed areas for both ends, and then there's the dead center. And he goes into explanation on that particular aspect. But like I said, for time's sake, I'm not reading all of that. And I wanted to include this because I really like the way that he had this done. So on this one, we have economic freedom. All the way to the left, we have socialism, economic authority, and state planning, and then social mixed economy, and then mixed economy, dead center. And then we go over to capital mixed economy, laissez-faire, capitalism, economic freedom. Personal freedom, liberalism, authoritarianism. Personal freedom versus personal authority. Attitude to change. We have progressivism to change, acceptance of change, to conservatism in the center, resistance and rejection to change, and then reaction, reversion to change, acceptance to change. And then we have government power and rule, regional state rights, attitude to international relations, level of equality, equal treatment, importance between an individual and a group of individuals, level of integration between the church and state, naturally secularism and regular. So I like how he's broken everything down. So I wanted to share that with you. Kid's an absolute genius. He really is. And he's broken down, he's just dichotomized the entire political spectrum in a way that I think that is easy to understand. So here we have his political views, and I think this is something that is very, very important to read through, as he has broken this down pretty eloquently. So economic freedom. I support social capital mixed economy. How capital I am. I support cryptocurrencies, private ownership, private business, free market, voluntary transactions, free trade within the country, less regulations, lower taxes, 20% for flat taxes, and between 1% and 20% for income progressive taxes, private healthcare, private education, private transport, private police, private fire defense. I don't agree with all of this, the privatization of some of these things, by the way, but I do think that he has a good political model. So anyway, private banks, capitalism, competition, deflation, prices based on supply and demand, no taxes, personal allowance only for the income below 10,000 pounds, unlimited consumer consumption, no rations, freedom of investment, foreign competition only between safe countries. And so what he is against: national retail sales tax, benefits for the church, minimum wage socialism, monopoly, I think it's supposed to be oligarchy, inflation, excessive money supply, fixed prices,
interventionism, state planning, limited consumer consumption rations, tariffs, taxes on international trade, occupation of Wall Street, Marxism, patents on ideas and thoughts, estate property tax, stimulus spending, cronyism, crony capitalism, corporatism, corruption, bribery, limited work time only for private employment. How social I am. I support public and taxpayer-funded education, public and taxpayer-funded healthcare, public and taxpayer-funded transport, public and taxpayer-funded police, free fire defense, free banks, fair pension for the elderly, benefits and supports for the needy, including the disabled, child benefits for family, flat taxes for the middle class and upper class, income, progressive taxes for the lower class, environmental protection, military intervention, welfare, social programs, government budget balance, trade union, extent, condition, copyright, only basic parts, not stricter parts. And what he is against? Gold standard, high deficits, and high debts. Personal freedoms. I am mostly a liberal U.S. language libertarian and somewhat authoritarian. How liberal U.S. language libertarian I am. I support recreational cannabis, medical cannabis, abortion on request, demand, gay marriage, joint and step adoption of children by gay couples, gun ownership, bodily autonomy, privacy, freedom of speech, that includes hate speech and blasphemy, freedom of expression, freedom of thoughts, freedom of press, freedom of belief, prostitution, pornography, gender transition, civil unions, homeschooling, school choice, in vitro IVF fertilization. And I'm pretty much all for those things as well. And what he is against: torture, slavery, political correctness, censorship, cultural Marxism, affirmative action, death penalty, criminal conviction of victimless crimes, racial profiling, smoking bans, internet censorship, gay conversion therapies, hate crimes, crimes including violence on the ground of race, etc., social justice, fascism, communism, Nazism. And I'd have to agree with that stuff as well. How authoritarian I am. I support regulation on cannabis, regulation on abortion, regulation on gun ownership, regulation on prostitution, regulation on pornography, border fence, longer sentencing for severe and harmful crimes, chemical castration for sex offenders, mandatory education for main and national languages. What he is against: religious extremism, the intent of violence and terrorism, illegal undocumented immigration, euthanasia except in cases of coma, treason, biological form of cloning, and surrogacy. Attitude change varies by country, civilization, and current date and time. For safe, developed civilizations and country, I am mostly a conservative. For example, I support the keeping and the conservation of existing but respected human rights and prosperity. B. For unsafe, undeveloped, and backward civilizations and country, I am mostly to fully a progressive U.S. language liberal. For example, I support the reforms of human rights and economic reforms. Governmental power and rule, I support republic, rule of law, and constitution. Regional power, duty, rule, control, and centralization. I support mostly unitary state. Specifically, I support the decentralized unitary state, while I support the whole country to have the right to control most of the country's properties. I support the separate regions to have the right to control some of its properties, including parks, nature reserves, statues, cemeteries, public churches, and other reserves. And here's the attitude in relations to policies and... Okay, so mostly a nationalist and somewhat a globalist. How nationalist I am. I support a country to be an independent and a sovereign nation, a country to have its own flag, a country to have its own emblem, a country to have its own monetary and fiscal policy, a country to have its own festive culture, a country to have its own cuisine, a country to have its own landmarks, a country to have its own language. And against international law on individual rights, only for dangerous and hostile countries, international free trade, only for dangerous and hostile countries, language to be recognized as a main and official language worldwide, only for safe countries. How globalist he is. And support international law on individual rights only for safe countries, international free trade only for safe country. Language to be recognized as a main and official language worldwide. Level of equality. So I think that gives you kind of a rough estimate, I would say. And I don't agree. I'm pretty on par with Awesome Polish Kid, but there are some minor, very minor differences. And so I hope that gives you kind of an idea of how the political axis or four-quadrant political spectrum works. And it certainly doesn't work the way that it does, like Punctual Progress was pointing out, and where the left and the right and authoritarian versus anti-authoritarian comes from.
I hope you enjoyed our little journey down this rabbit hole. This will conclude this video, and there will be others about the similar subject matter. So don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, and hit the bell button on any channel you're subscribed to. And see you next time. With that, I'm out.
Take the way.